So I just want to briefly go over this cell membrane transport summary chart that's in my notes. This really shows all the ways that material can move in and out of a cell. And there are two major categories of how particles or molecules move in and out of the cell. One major category is passive transport. The other major category is active transport. The difference between the two is with passive transport, you require no ATP. The cell uses no additional energy to move materials in and out of the cell. Whereas with active transport, whatever type of active transport there is, the cell needs to expend energy in the form of ATP. So passive transport, no energy is expended. Active transport, energy is expended. Within passive transport, you have simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. Both are types of diffusion. That means in both cases, particles will be going from a high to a low concentration. They will be going down the concentration gradient. The difference is, with facilitated diffusion, you're moving bigger or polar, which means charged particles. So for example, glucose, which is C6H12O6, or ions, which are charged, they can't just pass through the phospholipid bilayer, so they'll need to go through a transport protein. And that transport protein can either be a channel protein or a carrier protein. The difference between that is channel proteins are just a straight channel that particles can go through, whereas a carrier protein will actually change its shape for when particles go through. Within active transport, you have either a pumping mechanism or what's called bulk transport. With the pumping mechanism, you're dealing with a carrier protein. And why does this carrier protein need to pump molecules from one side of the cell membrane to the other? Well, because those particles are trying to go from a low concentration to a high concentration. So since they're trying to go against the concentration gradient, that carrier protein must pump those particles from one side to the other. And if you think of diffusion, going down a concentration gradient, kind of like biking downhill, where you can still move even if you don't expend any energy, pumping against the concentration gradient would then be like biking uphill, where you do have to expend energy. So the cell is using energy in the form of ATP. So that's why it's active transport, because it uses energy. Finally, you have bulk transport. Two types of bulk transport. Endocytosis, you can think of N as in. So it's when the cell membrane actually folds into the particle and creates a vesicle or a vacuole and brings that particle inside the cell. So the membrane actually folds around the particle that's trying to come in the cell. Exocytosis, you can think of exo as exit or leaving the cell. So the same type of process happens, but you're wrapping the membrane around the particle and pinching it off and sending it outside the cell. This type of transport would be used by much bigger particles that are non-soluble in water. So those particles wouldn't be able to go through either the cell membrane or even through a carrier protein in the membrane. They would have to go through this process of either endocytosis to bring it inside the cell or exocytosis to take that particle outside the cell. And yes, this type of process would use energy in the form of ATP, and that's why it's considered active transport.